Welcome to Detroit Opera's OperaHere podcast. This is Arthur White coming to you from the Detroit Opera House. And joining me today is Nathalie Doucet, the head of music and director of the Detroit Opera Resident Artist Program. Nathalie, thank you so much for being here once again.
Arthur, I love talking opera with you. And to all our listeners, we're thrilled you have joined us today as we take a look at Kurt Weill's opera Down in the Valley. This production marks the first time Detroit Opera has mounted this work in our 54-year history. And today, we will speak a bit about the opera, its composer, Kurt Weill, and hear from a scholar on Kurt Weill's life and work. Down in the Valley is a part of a double bill which opens December 7th and runs through December 13th at the Detroit Opera House.
Kurt Weill was a German-American composer born on March 2nd, 1900 in Dessau, Germany. He grew up in a religious Jewish family, and his father was a cantor. At the age of 12, Weill began taking piano lessons, and by 13, he writes an early composition, Mi Adir, a Jewish wedding song. In 1918, at the age of 18, he enrolls at the Berlin Hochschule für Musik, where he studies with Engelbert Humperdinck, the famed composer of Hansel and Gretel. During the 1920s, he finds great success on the stage, collaborating on many productions with Bertolt Brecht, including the Three-Penny Opera, his most successful work, and featuring his wife, the famed chanteuse Lotte Lenya. However, after his 1930 opera, The Rise and Fall of Mahagoni, Weill, who was Jewish, is disavowed and flees Nazi Germany in 1933. After some time spent in Europe, he eventually arrives in the U.S. and he settles in New York City in 1935. It would be an understatement to say Weill reinvented himself in the United States. He completely loved and embraced America and American pop music. He goes on to find great success in Hollywood and on the Broadway stage with such works as Knickerbocker Holiday, Lady in the Dark, and One Touch of Venus. Street Scene, his most serious and dramatic work for the stage, with a libretto by Langston Hughes, goes on to win Weill the Tony for Best Original Song in 1947.
Down in the Valley is a folk opera in one act. It was originally written for the radio at the suggestion of Olin Downs, the music critic at the New York Times. However, the project fell through due to a lack of sponsorship. Weill revised the opera to a longer format, and it was finally premiered at Indiana University's School of Music in 1948. Weill's engagement with the music of his adopted homeland reflects the search for belonging among immigrant communities. Down in the Valley weaves several traditional American songs into a tragic tale of love and loss. It begins and ends in a Birmingham jail cell on the eve of the execution of Brack, a teenage boy convicted of murdering the man who tried to take Jenny, Brack's beloved, away from him. Told partly in flashback, this simple story of ill-fated romance and shattered innocence is as timeless as it is universal.
Wow. So I have to ask you, first of all, Nathalie, what was your first experience with Kurt Weill? When did you first become aware of his name and his music?
I remember being in my studies, doing my master's degree at l'Université de Montréal, and our opera department there did a version of the Mahagoni Songspiel, which is based on Das kleine Mahagoni. So it's a smaller version of the Mahagoni. And I remember being mesmerized by the music and how it sounded a little bit German, but also a little bit American. And I had to research more about what Weill was and who he was. And then I dove into a lot of the songs because, as a collaborator, something I do a lot is play with singers. And I started introducing songs into the repertoire of the singers I was working with. And since then, I've really played so much Kurt Weill songs. And what's interesting is that they're not classical, but also they're not pop either. So there's a little bit of a crossover feeling when you sing any Weill song. So a jazz singer can sing a Weill song and an opera singer can sing a Weill song, and it sounds great either way. So I love that. And this year, because we're looking at Kurt Weill and we're producing a Kurt Weill opera with the resident artists, I have assigned a lot of Kurt Weill music. And for some of them, they're discovering these songs, and for some of them, they've heard them. but it's always a nice stretch to do a Kurt Weill song in a program. It's always fun to do, and it's always either extremely dramatic or very playful. So I really love that.
Yeah. I guess I first became aware of him. I was in my 20s back in the 1990s. I'm old. And I was sang in a couple of productions in Chicago. One was Knickerbocker Holiday, which I loved. And then One Touch of Venus, which I loved even more. And so it's been wonderful hearing some of the artists under your charge, the resident artists, because they've been performing some of these songs from One Touch of Venus, for example. And it's kind of taken me back to my youth. So thank you for that.
Yes, Mia Maldino performs I'm a Stranger Here myself, and she does a great job with it. And it was so fun to watch her discover how to sing this music and really have fun with it.
Well, nobody can outsing her now. I can tell you that. I found a clip on YouTube of Kurt Weill in his voice talking about how much he loved America. And he said, the minute my ship rolled in to the harbor in New York, I knew I was home. I know, of course, you were born in Canada. And so what is it like sort of having to come to this brand new place? I know, was French your very first tongue, and then you had to come to America, not had to come, but you came to America with this new language and new culture. Could you maybe talk about that, since you have that in common with Weill?
Definitely. French is my mother language, and I grew up and studied in French my whole life in Canada. And then I have lived many places, and I came to the United States from Canada briefly, then went back to Canada. But most recently, before coming to Detroit, I came from Amsterdam, where I lived for 12 years. So I've been like all over the place, but I describe it as a sort of Canada's not that different from the US, though it is a bit different, but definitely coming from Europe and coming back to America was like a reverse culture shock. And so you have to really kind of find out how to live in a new environment, and when things are, readily available for you, or having to deal in a different language all the time. My English is excellent, but there is always that little moment sometimes when I'm tired, or when maybe my syntax is off, or I don't really understand idiosyncrasies of the language. So it's a little bit always kind of depending on how tired I am, and where I am in my day, that my English is a little bit more struggling, like right now. And but definitely I love living in the States. I really am a big fan of the US, and I've always felt at home here. And specifically my time in Michigan, now 4 years and counting. Michigan has really welcomed me with open arms, and the Detroit Opera, of course, as well. So I feel really at home here. And I'm sure Kurt Weill also felt the same, because he writes about the US in such an affectionate way. So I know how he feels. I feel a kinship to that.
Yeah, it was a shame we lost him. He passes away just after his 50th birthday in 1950, and it just would have been curious to know like what we would have heard, what more would we have gotten from him, would he have produced, at least musically, had he had a little more time on this earth.
I would imagine that he might have taken Down in the Valley and maybe expanded it a little bit and made it into a 3 act or something,
Ooh,
maybe.
ooh.
Or, yeah, I always think that about composers who die young, and what their output would have been had they lived another 20, 30 years, and how their music would have evolved, and how that would have changed the landscape of their artistic output. So I'm always very curious about that question. But certainly Weill had a style of his own, and it's really something that nobody else did. And I think it's an extraordinary output already. What he did, Street Scene, is of course an amazing opera, but Down in the Valley is reminiscent of that, and it's really a very good story to tell.
Wow, very good. Well, we have three recurring stars who are coming to star in this production of Devon Tynes, who made such a big splash as Malcolm X and X Life and Times of Malcolm X when he was here back in 22. And also another person from that cast, Victor Ryan Robertson, who played Elijah Muhammad. So it's very excited to have these two gentlemen back, as well as Nicole Heaston, who made such a splash last season in Ronaldo. What do you think about all these three coming back in this one production?
Well, Arthur, this is a powerhouse lineup. I have to say, Devon Tynes, who is one of our favorites here in Detroit, that we've seen come back and spent so much time in our community. We love him here, and I'm excited to see what he's going to do with it. Nicole Heaston, as you said, was such a an amazing presence in Ronaldo, and what a voice this woman has is just absolutely incredible. I love Victor. He was incredible as in our Malcolm X production as Elijah and Street, and what a dynamic, magnetic singer he is, and just was a crowd favorite as I remember it in Malcolm X. So I'm absolutely over the moon with this cast, and of course Roberto Calb at the helm of this as well. And just kind of, this is a an alignment that we don't see that often, so I'm really excited about this cast.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see Devon Tynes, who, I'm so used to seeing him in more, I don't want to say alpha male, but, really strong, powerful characters. But Bob here is, he's a sweet man who's, trying to make everything work, and he's trying to appease everyone. So I'm really curious to see how his personality is going to change, dramatically, and of course, vocally as well. But he can do anything. So I can't wait to see what it's going to be.
I mean, Devon has such a huge palette of emotional colors in his voice and in his presence, and he can be vulnerable, he can be strong. That's why we love watching him. That's why we ask him back over and over again. He's just an incredible presence in general as a person, as an artist. So I'm excited. Yeah, always happy to see Devon back.
Very good. We should also mention once again that Down in the Valley, which opens December 7th, is a part of a double bill with William Grant's Still Highway 1 USA. And so they'll both be performed on the same night, one after the other. But of course, today's conversation is really kind of focused in on Down in the Valley. Now, this might be a fantastic time to bring in an expert on all things Kurt Weill. I am so pleased to welcome our special guest today. She is an associate professor at the University of Georgia's School of Music. She earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her dissertation, found in translation, Kurt Weill on Broadway and in Hollywood, 1935 to 1939, earned her the Glenn Hayden Award for an outstanding dissertation in musicology. Her research centers on 20th century American music, especially the Broadway stages of the 1930s and 1940s. She is currently writing a book on Kurt Weill's American career, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Please welcome Naomi Graber.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Naomi. It's so nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us. We're going to ask you a few questions because we are producing Down in the Valley by Kurt Weill, and it's very exciting. So you are an expert on the matter. My first question would be, by 1945, Kurt Weill is living and working in the United States for about 10 years, and he writes a radio version of Down in the Valley. It's a short 20-minute opera based on folk songs, but the premiere never happened. What can you tell us about this?
So my understanding is that it just never got picked up. They recorded a pilot, they shopped it around, and no one was interested. Weill wasn't really the person driving the project. That was Olin Downs, who was the critic for the New York Times at the time. And Weill pretty quickly moved on to other things. It was a very short episode. But there is a recording of that original pilot. It's very interesting, and you can hear the original version if you go to the Kurt Weill Foundation in New York.
Wow. Well, so Naomi, by 1948, the opera then is staged at Indiana University. Do we know if that stage version was any different from that original radio version?
Yeah, it was a little bit different. The radio show is only about 20 minutes, which is not really enough even for a one-act opera. So Weill expanded it a little bit. He added a lot of underscore, and he added some recitative to make it really into an opera. If you listen to the radio version, it has just dialogue. And he added 2 arias. He beefed up the characters of Brack and Jenny. They each get their own aria in the version that most people hear today. Where is the one for Brack, and Brack Wiener, my true love, for Jenny.
Yeah. So I know there were a couple of recordings that were made shortly after that, RCA and Decca. Is it still very widely performed today?
Yeah, it's not very often professionally performed, I suspect, just because it's so short, which means you really need to do it, a lot of people, if they do perform it professionally, will do it as a one act opposite another one act. But colleges do it a lot because it's written with young singers in mind. Both of those arias are really good for young voices. We actually did it here at UGA a few years ago. I sang in the chorus. We did it with a community choir in the opera studio. It's a really beautiful piece. And I had a lot of fun just getting to know it so intimately. There's nothing like performing a piece to get to know it.
I know Crane School of Music, SUNY Potsdam, is doing it right now. So seeing that come up because a lot of my friends teach there and they're doing it. So I think that's really exciting. A good amount of your research looks at Weill once he arrives in the U.S. In 1935. The influence of jazz was already present in his work, the penny opera back in 1928. How did jazz or American pop music culture and just living in New York shape his music once he arrived here?
When Weill came here, he later said something interesting about how he thought of America in Germany. He said, America was to us what Italy was to Shakespeare, or what Turkey was to Mozart, this kind of imagined land. And so if you listen to Weill's, what he would have called jazz and the Three Penny Opera, or in some of his other works, it doesn't sound anything like the jazz that was in America. He got to the United States and realized he was very out of date. He was mostly listening to, if anything, kind of Louis Armstrong, who had, that was about 10 years old by the time he got to the United States. And so he basically he almost gave up on that style of jazz and started writing in a kind of just more mainstream style. He started to embrace the full orchestra a little bit more. If you listen to his earlier pieces, the orchestration is very, very spare. But the really interesting thing to me is that he really, really embraced the Broadway business practices. He knew that, especially early on, especially in 1935, that you just needed one song from a show to be a hit, and then you had it made. And so even in his earliest correspondence, he knows he needs to write that one song. And so all of his shows up through really about 1945, you can tell, oh, he knows this is the song that is going to make it. And so he starts basically writing jazz standards. And some of the songs are still standards today. Things like September Song and Speak Low. Mac the Knife is a little bit earlier. Mac the Knife actually comes from that German period. But my favorite parts of some of my favorite parts of Weill's correspondence is when he's talking to his publisher, being like, "Why are you pushing my song? This is a great song. Everybody loves it. Why is it not out there? Why are there not dance band arrangements? Why are stars not covering it?" So I would say that America had a really, really profound effect on his business practices more than anything else. He's always somebody who kind of looked at the music around him and adapted it for his own purposes. And you can hear that in Down in the Valley and other things. But he really does move away from kind of traditional jazz when he comes to America and starts writing more kind of what we think of as jazz standards.
I would say that a lot of people probably know his music, but don't realize that it's Kurt Weill that wrote it, because a lot of those standards are so popular and they've been sung so many times.
Yeah, whenever I say I work on Kurt Weill, everyone goes, "Who's that?" I go, "The guy who wrote Mac the Knife." And they're like, "Oh yeah, I love that song."
So, Naomi, I was listening to a short audio clip earlier of Weill in an interview where he states, he knew America was going to happily be his new home the minute his ship had pulled in to New York City Harbor at 35. America has sometimes had a complicated relationship with immigrants to this country. What was Weill's experience as an exiled immigrant arriving in the midst of the Great Depression?
That's a really interesting question. Is this the interview from I'm an American, which happened sometime like 1941, 1942?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. It's important to remember that interview happened, I think, right after the United States entered World War II. It was either right after or right before. Like I said, I can't remember if it was 41 or 42. And while Weill really did sincerely love the United States. You can see that in his private correspondence as well as his kind of public effusions about the United States. He knew that his position was somewhat precarious. And so when he's saying that, it is sincere. He echoes the same thing in his letters to Maxwell Anderson several years later when he finally goes back to Europe. But he may be laying it on a little bit thick because he knows that there's people out there who are not exactly happy that he's here, especially once the war starts. Weill is very involved, even before the United States enters the war, even in like 38, 39. He's writing to a lot of other German immigrants saying, we have to convince them that we're not spies. We have to convince them that we're not a fifth column. And we have to convince them that we are loyal Americans. And he has all sorts of ideas about this that never quite come to fruition, but you can definitely see it in his works from kind of the late 30s and early 40s, especially something like Knickerbocker Holiday, where there's literally a song in there called How Can You Tell an American? And it's all about Europeans becoming Americans. And so he's showing, yes, Europeans can be Americans. We can be loyal. We can be faithful. We can embody these American ideals of individualism and hard work and all of these things. During the war, he was very involved in the war effort. He wrote a lot of propaganda songs. He composed a couple of film scores for the war. He did a radio drama for the war. And he did one of the most interesting projects he got involved in was something called the Lunchtime Follies, which were these variety shows that would be put on in factories during their lunch break. And Weill, as an immigrant, and especially as a German immigrant, had to get special permission to enter those factories. When he was working in Los Angeles, he was under a curfew because he was a German immigrant. So he had to get special permission to, be on film sets and things like that. So even though he was genuinely a patriotic American, he definitely struggled with a lot of that. He definitely knew that there were people in the United States who wished he wasn't there.
Yeah, you mentioned Knickerbocker Holiday. I mean, Weill has such a rich library of songs and a lot of things that we remember him by, especially his Broadway shows like Lady in the Dark and One Touch of Venus, which actually put Mary Martin on the map. And then he wrote Street Scene, which is, by all accounts, an operatic work, but also very crossover-like. Some people might consider it musical theater, but the orchestration and the way it's written is more operatic. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Street Scene was probably Weill's, I think the piece that was probably closest to Weill's heart. Throughout his career, even before he got to America, Weill had this idea of popular music. The phrase he often uses is popular music in the highest sense of the term. He thought that the kind of pinnacle of popular music was someone like Bach or someone like Mozart, people whose works were popular in their time and were heard by not just the aristocracy, but by, just kind of the general person on the street, but that still had something really important to say. So that the two that come to mind when Weill talks about this are the St. Matthew Passion and the Magic Flute, which is a Singspiel. It's, sort of popular opera. It's not the Marriage of Figaro or Don Giovanni or, anything that was performed at court. And so Weill, when he is composing, that's always what he's thinking about, is he's thinking about how to reach the average consumer with something that is deeply meaningful and that still speaks their language. And Street Scene is probably the embodiment of that. It was always meant for Broadway. He didn't use the term opera initially when he was originally putting it out there because he was afraid the idea of opera might scare it away. It might scare audiences away. But as soon as the critics started using the word opera, he was like, "Oh, of course it's an opera." He variously called it's an American opera, it's a Broadway opera. It has a lot in common with some of the Verismo stuff of people like Puccini and Mascagni and so on and so forth. But it is very, very much American. There's blues in it. There's kind of a pastiche 20s Tin Pan Alley song. It has some pretty straightforward Broadway numbers alongside these beautiful soaring arias. And so Street Scene was such an important piece to Weill because it really was this perfect crystallization of popular music and this idea of music for the populace that was still rich in meaning and quality, but that still spoke their language.
How close was the composition between Down in the Valley and Street Scene, and did they have some kind of influence on each other?
Oh, they were back to back. Olin Downs at one point calls Down in the Valley a kind of pendant to Street Scene. In fact, they're sort of two sides of the same coin. One of the interesting things about Street Scene is that it's an urban story. Obviously, it takes place on the streets of New York, but the critics read it as a folk opera. That's what they call it. They say it has a kind of homespun charm. It's a kind of urban folktale. And Weill and his librettist, Langston Hughes, actually visited the Folklore Society of New York to get inspiration for some of the one of the more folkloric moments in the show, which is the children's game. So they're deeply, deeply intertwined, even though they seem to take place in such different locations.
So Naomi, you mentioned African American poet Langston Hughes as the librettist for Street Scene. Was that choice, having a librettist African American at that time, would it have been surprising or at all risky for Weill in 1947?
It may have been surprising. I don't think it would have been risky specifically in 1947, especially because Street Scene comes out very early in 1947. It's January 1947, if I'm not mistaken. 5 years later, yes, that it almost certainly would have been a problem. It certainly was probably not the expected choice. You do find a few mixed race creative teams on Broadway at this time. The other one that comes out right around the same time is a Duke Ellington, John Latouche piece called, what's it called? It may be called The Beggar's Opera. It's Duke Ellington's take on The Beggar's Opera, which is the piece that Kurt Weill based the Three Penny Opera on. So it's sort of a similar project. There are a couple of mixed race cast shows that are showing up on Broadway at the same time. There's a big Showboat revival in 1946, which I have this feeling may have been produced by Rodgers and Hammerstein, although you'll have to check me on that. So it's not unheard of, but it's definitely not terribly common. And Langston Hughes was an interesting choice because he'd never done lyrics before. He was, of course, a spectacular poet. But he was an amateur lyricist. So if he was going to go for a Black lyricist, Langston Hughes certainly would not have been the first person that people would have thought of.
I think it would be really difficult to talk about Kurt Weill without talking about his wife, who was the singer and actress, Lotte Lenya, who was present on and off the stage for many of his greatest successes. What can you tell us about her and their relationship?
She's a fascinating figure, and her Weill interpretations are so wonderful, and they're so different. If you listen to her earliest recordings of, the early recordings of the Three Penny Opera, she played just about everybody in that show all the female parts in that show. And then, sort of the recordings from the 1950s of her singing Pirate Jenny all the way to the end of her life. She has this wonderful recording of September Song from relatively late in her life that is just absolutely beautiful. My favorite recording of her, by the way, is actually a duet between her and Louis Armstrong singing Mac the Knife. And it's really fascinating because it shows just how different the styles are, and both of them are so different and so perfect.
He even throws her name in, as I recall, in that duet, as I recall.
Oh, yes, he does. Yes. They had Lenya was probably the one constant in his life. They met when they were both very young. They were formally introduced by Weill's first collaborator, just before Three Penny Opera, and she went on to star in a bunch of his German stuff. They separated for a little while in the early 30s. They got back together just before they emigrated to the United States. But they always kept in contact. Their letters to each other are wonderful. If you ever want a really good read, I highly recommend the Speak Low When You Speak Love, the volume of their letters. They were absolutely ruthless with each other. You can really get a sense of how much Weill hated, some of his time in Hollywood by the way he writes about his acquaintances to Lenya. She really struggled in the United States early on because she had a very heavy accent, and it was difficult for her to find work. She was a cabaret singer. Weill tried to write her into one of his shows, but it didn't really work. A show called The Firebrand of Florence, his only true flop in the United States. But, it was a marriage that had a lot of ups and downs, and she certainly was not happy that she wasn't able to work in America while he was alive. But she was always kind of there for him. He was, like, as I said, she was just the one constant. After he died, of course, she went on to have a brilliant career, in the revival of the Threepenny Opera and in From Russia with Love, which is the Bond movie that she's in. And then, of course, Cabaret. She's in the original cast of Cabaret.
But she's also, I guess, also forms the foundation after Kurt Weill dies.
Yes. And she's responsible for a lot of his legacy. She's the one who sort of, with the revival of the Threepenny Opera in 1954, kind of keeps things going. Her and a couple of other very important people.
Now, I understand, did they get divorced and then remarry? Is that correct also?
Yep. They got divorced. Oh gosh, early 30s, got married, I think, right before they emigrated to America.
He died shortly after his 50th birthday, right, of a heart attack. So was he having other health challenges? Was this like out of the blue? Did he just, was it just a fast way to go?
He saw it coming for a few months. He was sort of in and out of the hospital for a few months, but he was sort of working right up to the end. There's fragments of a version of Huckleberry Finn, a musical of Huckleberry Finn that he was writing at the time. He got like 3 or 4 songs in. But his brother had died of a heart attack a few years before, and so he knew that this was a congenital issue. So I don't think he knew he was going to die, but I think that it was on his mind, especially in those last couple of months.
Imagine all the music he could have written had he just lived longer.
It really it breaks my heart that he never got to see West Side Story, which is so indebted to Street Scene. Leonard Bernstein was a huge Kurt Weill person, and a lot of Bernstein's work is deeply indebted to Weill as well.
When you think about Kurt Weill, what do you think his legacy? What is his legacy?
So when I think about his legacy, one of the fascinating things about Kurt Weill's career is that especially between 1943 and the end of his life, he felt very overshadowed by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Lady in the Dark was a huge hit. It's kind of impossible to understate how big a hit Lady in the Dark was in 1941. And then Oklahoma comes along in 1943 and just blows it out of the water. That's the first Rodgers and Hammerstein. And Rodgers and Hammerstein gets the credit for kind of revolutionizing the Broadway musical and making it into this drama where music and dance and everything work together. Well, Lady in the Dark does the same thing, and for a lot of reasons kind of doesn't hit the same way as Oklahoma. But for the rest of Weill's life, he feels like he's playing catch up to Rodgers and Hammerstein. And you can see that in his correspondence. You can see that in the stuff that he writes. Street Scene has a lot of Carousel in it. Lost in the Stars has a lot of South Pacific in it. What's the other one? Love Life has a lot of Allegro in it. But he never really felt like he caught up. But I think he had a really interesting legacy in that when the 1960s and 70s came along, everyone started to look back at the Kurt Weill musicals and say, wait a minute, this is an alternative to the Rodgers and Hammerstein paradigm of this integrated musical. So if you look at shows like Company, shows like Cabaret, which is, Cabaret is it's obviously modeled on the Threepenny Opera, and critics recognized that. And in case you didn't get the message, there's Lotte Lenya front and center. Starting around Cabaret, people start to rediscover the Kurt Weill style of musical theater, and it becomes the concept musical. So without Kurt Weill, you don't have Company, you don't have Cabaret, you don't have Chicago, you don't have Chorus Line. All of these shows where that don't necessarily have a linear plot, but that use music to elucidate a broader theme or connect the theme with broader issues, and use music to comment on the plot rather than kind of move the plot forward. That, I think, really is Kurt Weill's legacy. That and West Side Story, which is, like, as I said, extremely close to Street Scene. A lot of American opera comes from Porgy and Bess, which was an inspiration to Street Scene. There's also a lot of Street Scene and other things. There's a lot of Down in the Valley in pieces like The Ballad of Baby Doe. There's a lot of Weill in the kind of American opera DNA as well because of Street Scene, which is this really big, important piece. It wasn't really received as such in its time, but it's become this kind of watershed moment. It's what links Porgy and Bess to West Side Story.
Do you ever think to yourself, what if he had lived another 20 years where his music might have gone? I wonder if he would have done, more works like, Street Scene.
Well, the Huckleberry Finn piece was, I think, going to be closer to something like Down in the Valley. But as I said, those pieces are very interconnected. If Weill had lived a lot longer, I suspect he would have been blacklisted. He starts speaking out against the blacklist in 47 and 48. He just dies before he can go on trial. I suspect that would have been a really interesting moment. And I don't know what would have happened after that. But especially after Lost in the Stars, which is the operatic version, Broadway operatic version of Cry the Beloved Country. It's a deeply anti-racist piece, and it's a really beautiful piece.
Were there any other, Naomi, any other issues or topics that you think we should bring up that we haven't maybe mentioned or touched on?
Well, I guess I could bring up the fact that Down in the Valley, sort of to piggyback off my earlier answer, Down in the Valley is basically a rewrite of Oklahoma. And I mean, the central question is who's going to take the girl to the dance. The whole thing ends in a scuffle between the villain and the ostensible hero. And then there's a kind of fake trial, which we never actually see in Down in the Valley, because the villain dies under suspicious circumstances. But then it goes completely the other way. In Oklahoma, they absolve Curly from Judd's death, but in Down in the Valley, Brack Weaver, we assumed, is put to death. And that's what I mean when I say Weill is competing with Rodgers and Hammerstein. Is Down in the Valley it's written 2 years after Oklahoma. Both Downs and Weill are, they look at Oklahoma and go, really, that? Like, it's fine. It's too commercial.
But then they come back and they steal the story. So I don't know.
It's like, well, this is what the real American opera should look like. I find it really productive to read Down in the Valley as a kind of answer to Oklahoma.
That's fantastic.
It's also fascinating. I love hearing you talk about it because it's a lot of things that I don't know about. Yeah, I love it. It's great. No, I mean, Kurt Weill has been part of my life for a long time. I play his music all the time, but I never really, I know a lot about him, but not, I've never really delved into some of the topics we did today. So I really enjoyed this, actually.
Yeah.
I really recommend that Speak Low and You Speak Love. Those letters are just fantastic.
I will look at that. So I had a little bit of Weill experience when I was in my 20s in Chicago. I sang in a lot of shows. I sang in Knickerbocker and I sang in One Touch of Venus, which I just loved. But I was just listening to Mary Martin sing. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize what a glory. I guess I always knew Mary Martin later in her career.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but with listening to her back at this time, One Touch of Venus, she sounded like an angel. My goodness.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
We have resident artists here, and I've assigned them all Kurt Weill pieces this year to kind of, plunge them in the world of Weill. And a lot of them knew about Kurt Weill, but they knew some of the songs that I've like, I'm a Stranger Here Myself, and the Saga of Jenny, and Mac the Knife. I have one of my young baritones singing that. So it's really nice to watch them kind of dive into that world and to perform this music and people love it. They just adore everything Kurt Weill.
Yeah, he's so fabulous. I hesitate to call him a hidden gem because the people who know about him, but he's somehow kind of, when we think about the Great American Songbook, Gershwin, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hart. Weill often feels like he's been sort of shunted off to the side, but his music is just as wonderful and really, I think, deserves much more attention than it gets. And so I'm thrilled you guys are doing Down in the Valley. I mean, that's such a beautiful piece. It's one of my absolute favorites. I mean, even I who love Kurt Weill, like that's at the top of my, list of the Kurt Weill works I just absolutely love.
Fantastic. How did you decide to become such an expert on Kurt Weill specifically? Was there something in particular that just drew you to him or his work?
It's actually a weird story. In my first semester of graduate school, they took us to they did kind of a field trip to the Library of Congress. And me, little baby grad student, went, do you think they'd let me look at the Bob Fosse papers? And yes, they did, in fact, let me look at the Bob Fosse papers. And so I started looking through the Fosse papers, and I hadn't, I kind of vaguely knew Mac the Knife, but I started looking through and like the reviews of the 1975 Chicago saying, oh, everyone, they keep mentioning this Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht character. Like what's going on here? I didn't really know about them. So I got an internship to work at the Library of Congress, looking at the Fosse papers in the afternoon, but in the morning, they had me cataloging the papers of a guy named John McGlynn. Okay, so yeah, John McGlynn is a conductor who reconstructed a lot of older Broadway shows. His most famous recording is Showboat. He did a very famous studio recording of Showboat in 1988, I want to say. But he had all of these scores, and I stumbled across a score for Love Life, which is one of Weill's later shows. I think it's 1948, and they just released the first full recording of it. It's almost never done. But I noticed that Love Life was basically Chicago. It's not the same plot as Chicago, but it's the same conceit as Chicago, which is vaudeville acts in between scenes commenting on the plot. And that was what really started my interest in Weill.
Because I think you did your dissertation, right, around Kurt Weill as well.
I did. It was just his works from 35 to 39. But yeah, and then I listened to Lady in the Dark for the first time, and I was hooked. Lady in the Dark is another really beautiful score.
Naomi Graber, it has been such a thrill to have you on the OperaHere podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for having me. I've had a grand time.
Nathalie, thank you again for joining me. I always learn so much every time you're with me.
Same for me, Arthur. I love talking opera with you, and you have such a wealth of knowledge. And thank you to everyone listening to our glimpse into Detroit Opera's production of Down in the Valley. We hope to see you at the Detroit Opera House for the exciting double bill of Down in the Valley and Highway 1 USA, which opens December 7th and runs through December 13th at the beautiful Detroit Opera House.
To purchase tickets to Down in the Valley and Highway 1 USA, or find more information about the production, please visit our website at DetroitOpera.org. You can also connect with us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And thanks to Jake Neer for his assistance in producing these podcasts. And we will see you at the opera.